Ladies and gentlemen, fellow feathers in arms, welcome back to the Conversations That Quack, episode number 2, your conversational podcast for the issues that linger when the lights go up and the credits are long over. I am one of your hosts, Brandan Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the man, the myth, a quack who must ask himself if he'll have the strength to do what must be done. Yfran Garcia. How's it going, Yfran?
It is going well. Thanks for having me again. After the first one, we're back for the second. So thanks for having me again. But I'm doing well. Thanks.
Very nice. Of course, of course. If you are just joining us, listeners, well into the future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Yfran and I rock an often candid and honest conversation about the issues behind our movie of the week and where that ultimately leaves us as people. If you enjoy what you hear, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a Patreon of one of our tiers that start as low as $1, which includes early access to podcasts like these, as well as our sister podcast, The Movies That Quack, where co-host Wade Slickton and I put each other on the spot each week to ask each other Hollywood's most poignant and stupid questions, as well as Rabbit Holes That Quack, where co-host Nicole Matthews and I do a weekly deep dive into a documentary every week. But of course, if parting with that dollar is not in the cards for you right now, that is more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for more upcoming shenanigans from Pandora's Quack. And so, without further ado, these are the Conversations That Quack. Tonight's movie of the week is called American Skin. American Skin is a 2019 film about a Marine veteran working as a school janitor who tries to mend his relationship with his son after a divorce. When his son is killed by a police officer found innocent without standing trial, he takes matters into his own hands. It is written and directed by Nate Parker, who previously brought us 2016's The Birth of a Nation, stars Amari Hardwick, Theo Rossi, and Bo Knapp, amongst others. Currently on Rotten Tomatoes, the critics put it at 37%, but the audience score puts it at 95. Two things before we begin. One, to address the potential elephant in the room by watching this movie, and two, a bit of housekeeping. First, Nate Parker is a public figure of controversy for a situation that he was acquitted of that you can choose to Google or not and make up your own mind about or not. I personally take the broad stance that art and artists can and should be separated because of art's enduring ability to both educate and change minds. Of course, I know that there are infinite nuances and infinite layers of moral context, and that separation can get quite complicated. But just wanted folks to know that we're not here to talk about the messenger, only the message. Second, this is going to be a spoiler-filled. Repeat spoilers will be in play, simply because I don't think there's a good way to really dive into this movie without it. And to go into this movie fairly cold, I think, is the best way to experience it. So if you haven't seen American Skin, bookmark this podcast and come back. Otherwise, this is your one and only spoiler warning off the top. So, even last week we watched American Son, a total coincidence that we have two titles with American in them, but interesting nonetheless. And I think we both more or less agreed that American Son was a solid recommendation from both of us, but that it also seemed to fall short in really examining the issue that it presented. To oversimplify here, police brutality against unarmed black men, amongst other sort of racial issues. So as serendipitous as it may have been to follow that up this week with American Skin, let's first dive into what were your expectations, I would say, heading into this. I think as we closed out last week, you kind of caught the trailer or something. What was sort of your read on what you thought this movie was going to be?
Yeah, I mean, look, I said it plenty of times last week, and I'll say it again this week. I liked American Son.
Yeah.
Before I get into my expectations, I just want to say I loved American Skin. So I liked American Son, loved American Skin.
Yeah.
I think my expectation was more, I guess, more of an analysis into why the cops are the way that they are. And I think I got more than that in this. I got the answer to that question, and I got more than that with this revolt, this rebellion, this active revenge on Nate Parker, whose character's name is Link. in this movie as well. So just want to start by saying that was my expectation. And this movie way exceeded my expectation. I have to say this every week, but I am not a movie critic. I call it as I see it.
Yeah.
Calling a spade a spade. But this movie was fantastic for me.
Yeah, I agree. I remember watching the trailer and was thinking it was going to be a little bit more. I don't want to say it was thinking it was going to be an action movie, but I thought it may go a little bit into shootout and just sort of that kind of territory. I was actually really pleasantly surprised that not only was that kind of kept to an absolute minimum, but that the movie actually was far more dramatic than I was expecting. And I agree with your statement for sure about, I think, liking American Sun and then loving American Skin. Definitely was far more poignant and cut much deeper than I was definitely expecting, or kind of on a idle Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, and look, I texted you immediately after I watched it, and I said this one is heavy.
Yeah.
There's a lot here to unpack. So let's just unpack it. I guess. I can start. I mean, for me, it's night and day with American Sun. I get the idea of American Sun now, but this one is American Skin is exactly what I wanted. When looking at the differences, looking at the social injustices that are happening among the African Americans and their interaction with police in today's society. The movie opens up and it immediately highlights how hard, an African American has to try to not upset a police officer. This is the truth, and this is the new norm. African American parents are teaching their kids how to interact with cops. That's something that white parents are not doing with their kids. It's now part of Black parenthood to teach your kid how to interact with a police officer. One wrong move or interaction can result in the loss of your life. And I prefer this movie to American Sun because it doesn't go on this long-winded narrative that focuses on the child's upbringing so that the viewer's preconceived notions about African Americans are validated in the end. The movie opens up by showing that none of that matters. Whatever you think of African American upbringing, their hard lives, their absent fathers, whatever silly stereotype that you are led to believe, none of that matters. Poor policing happens right at the beginning of this movie, which, as if you heard my thoughts last week about American Sun, I wanted them to focus on the police officer a little bit more, his training. But before you even learn about the child's history, you see poor policing in action. And that's why I like the start of this movie.
Yeah, I think what was great about the way that traffic stop was portrayed is that when we spoke about American Sun, I think people have this preconceived notion of, there was just this already inherently antagonistic sort of relationship. That's what must have happened. That's what must have set them off. That's what must have been, created sort of this, death as the only possible outcome. And I think what was really cool, I use that term loosely, but what was really interesting in the way that it was portrayed in this movie is that you see the scene and it's it's relaxed. It kind of starts relaxed and it kind of it's very, very normal. And then you can kind of see how something starts to just drift off course kind of for no reason. And it's one of those things where when you have these police officers that are sort of in this situation, and we'll dive into the training in a little bit, but just when you have police officers in this situation, it would be very interesting for people to watch this scene in a vacuum of various backgrounds and classes and such, and to just have them to discuss if they think that how they sort of read that scene, because as you're watching it, you're just kind of like, oh, this cop's being a little sort of paranoid. The one that was on the driver's side kind of talking to him, but you get it sort of thing. You know what I mean? It's not there's no antagonist thing. There's no this. It's just sort of okay, he's asking him sort of to step out. Is that necessary? But okay, I guess it's going to, and then as things start to then completely escalate, it kind of clearly gets to the point where you're just I don't think this is in any shape or form what should happen. And then kind of what we were left with American Sun was mostly just us speculating last week about well, what's the training? How does this person even sort of get into a situation where now there is no real way to go back from this crazy sort of point of view? It very clearly was this guy's kind of On the other side, Nate Parker's character, the dad, is essentially just sort of out, completely in control, completely calm. All the kids sort of doing a kid, very clearly a kid, has this sort of cell phone out, and then all of a sudden sort of guns are drawn and things just sort of get out of control again for no reason without provocation. And it's just a great sort of way of watching that scene sort of unfold and kind of setting the stage for a great movie.
Yeah, and we'll dive into that, of course. And I totally agree with everything you're saying. I think that the movie starts off calm, but you just know something's going to go wrong. It's almost an uneasy calm. Like you're watching it, he's doing everything he should be doing. They open up the window, the hands are both on the steering wheel. That they're in clear sight of the officer. He's announcing what he's going to do. Link, this is the father of the boy, is announcing what he's doing. He's narrating everything so he gets approval from the police officer and they understand that he is not a threat, nor his son. And then, it turns into chaos, and we go in to learn a little bit more about the son, who seems to be aware of his rights, who seems to be into government and the Supreme Court, because he had to know that for a class he's taking at school. And he knows what his rights are, even though his father tells him, and maybe I'm going a little bit too far, but he knows what his rights are. And I think this is an issue we spoke about before. I mean, we have this media that is amplifying being tough, knowing your rights, taking a stand against cops. And we see that with this child who is not necessarily taking a stand, is not following orders. Whether or not that matters, I say no, because he's just holding a cell phone. It is within his rights to record this interaction with this police officer. But it does get back to like what you were saying last week, Brandon, when you were mentioning, does the media amplify toughness? Does the media give this viral factor to resisting a police officer and not following orders to a police officer? Still within his rights to do what he was doing. But I do think it's interesting that he was completely ignoring the idea of like, put your cell phone down, because he believed that it was his right to record. Like his moral belief was that he had the right to record what was happening. Maybe out of fear. I'm not gonna put that out there, because we actually don't know why he kept on recording. Maybe he just believed it was his right to. But I definitely want to dive into this movie a little bit more and hear your thoughts as well there.
Yeah, that scene where Link the father is talking with Kajani, the son, when Kajani sort of just as you were saying, like he's in that government class and he basically is reading to his friend what his rights are. And he's like, no, like this is kind of, this is, he's studying up on this. And it's sort of like he's almost having this kind of excited moment where this revelatory moment where he's reading the law and all the rights that he has. And then it's really interesting to kind of I really appreciated how this scene wasn't, like normally when you see this scene and a father kind of comes in, it's a very, it's almost treated like a coming out scene or something like that, where it's like the father kind of sits down and just kind of like tells them that it's just like, hey, like, you got to do this, and sort of, the quote unquote, the talk. And what I thought was really interesting about this take on it was like a father not only telling his son, but his son's friend, which I thought was kind of a great touch and great detail, where he's just kind of like, look, this is the law, but the number one thing, paraphrasing, that you essentially have to keep in mind is what will get me home, kind of thing. And I thought that was just such like a heavy but like fascinating sort of like concept, kind of like you were saying, that it's just like when you have, African Americans who they have to consider things or put themselves in a different mindset than sort of other people sometimes. And this kid has to sort of now wrestle with, and, like when you're a kid, you kind of, deal in absolutes. And so this kid is literally reading what the law is. And his father is telling him, he's like, yes, that is true, but you have to understand that won't necessarily apply to us. And it's like, as I said, it's just a really heavy thing to think about, because it's like, how much of that is just subconscious for us now, like, it's not like we, there's a really great, I'll paraphrase sort of his quote. The guy, definitely don't remember the actor's name, but it basically was I think it's like a black captain or something like that on Deep Space Nine. And during one of those like conventions or something like that, he was asked, what was it like to sort of be, the first black, whatever. And one of the things he said that's like has stayed with me for forever is he's like, I don't think people realize, he's like, it's not like we get up every morning and then are like, okay, let's put on the black suit. He's like, we only really get reminded we're black when something goes wrong, or that when something is like amiss, or when something is whatever, or like this is happening. So he's like, am I, happy to be sort of the first black captain? He's like, I never really thought about that. Like, he's like, I just thought like, oh, this role is really cool. And I just did it. And then it was kind of everyone coming up and telling me like, oh, like that kind of thing. And so I wonder how subconscious all of these rules are, in the same way that, you just walk, but you don't think left foot, right foot, left foot, this amount of pressure. How much of these things do we have to compromise or filter our own thoughts, that, as Link was saying, that it's kind of like, hey, this is like a muscle you have to learn how to work out. This is something that you have to kind of start to calculate, that when you're in these situations, yes, again, like, the law, but like at the end of the day, you just want to make it home. You want to make it home to me, kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. And that was powerful as well when he said that, like, just to reiterate, this is the law, but it's not necessarily written for people like you and I, or like us.
Yeah.
Which is such a powerful, powerful line, and even the son was like, yeah, it sounds like he got it. And he understood what his father was saying. But I agree. I think that, like, getting back to the Deep Space Nine captain that you just mentioned, I think that that's one situation where he's the first black captain, and whether he thinks about that or not, I'll tell you what, like, in these police interactions, they know they're thinking about you being black.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a different situation, but I do think it's something that was a powerful statement, and there's just so many powerful statements in this movie, and we'll keep talking about it. But not only from Link, not only from the cops, but the documentary, the film crew. I forget the film crew, but I forget the guy's name from the film crew. But I think, like, there's so many great comments in this movie, and everything, almost everything, is so powerful. But yeah, let's keep it moving. I agree with you, but let's move on to the next scene, which is, this movie takes a real turn for me, Brandon. I have to say, like, I think that, like, the law that legally gives citizens the right to resist. This kid goes from that, and we're talking about that Kajani is learning about the law. But then what happens next is the police officer goes to trial, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that's when the predictability, like, that's when everything that you would expect to happen happens. Black Lives Matter protests, riots, property damage. As the police officer who killed an unarmed 14-year-old boy, Kajani, goes free and returns to his job. Not so different than what we see in reality. And we spoke about this last week, this lack of accountability on the police officer's end. But then the not so predictable is that, maybe from the trailers, but I thought, even watching it, I thought this was absolutely crazy. But I guess it is a man seeking justice in a broken criminal law system. The not so predictable is a veteran taking police officers hostage. I mean, my God, what a turn of events! The rest of this is quite insane, in my opinion. I personally think it's realistic to seek revenge or justice, but holding a trial inside of a police station, with the police officers being held hostage, how'd they even get that jury in there? All of it is just, I love it, but it's a little nuts for me at this point.
Yeah, I think there are two things. One, the found footage, this sort of like, we're watching a documentary sort of being made, sort of documentary. I thought that was actually a really nice touch, because, again, when you think about some of these movies that you see that try to handle messages like this, they can either be too heavy-handed, or they can kind of feel like they're preachy, or they can kind of feel like they're just it's just a message with some sort of narrative wrapped around it. But I think with having this sort of faux documentary inside of a movie format, sort of allowed it to kind of have these conversations and maybe ask questions that, like, the audience would be thinking, like, leading up to sort of that moment where you're kind of like, yeah, like, this is a peek inside of Link's life and how he's sort of dealing with all of this. And then I thought that when Not just the scene, before we get to sort of the hostage, but not just the scene when they're in the house of Link's wife, or kind of former wife, and how there's sort of like the police captain there, and even there was even sort of like tension there about like with the cops that were at the door, and then sort of the black captain that was sitting on the couch, and just sort of like, oh, what are you doing here, and all this kind of stuff. But I just really liked Amari Hardwick's character, sort of who's been diagnosed with cancer and has like a pretty just like, yeah, like this is just kind of how it is, and like I'm not going to lose my hair thing. I thought that was like they did a lot of great, very quick character work with him of just like, oh, this guy's like ride or die, but it like not in a cliche way. Like he's just like, yeah, like it's my time's up sort of thing. But I just really appreciated how he even laid out the playbook, which I've never really heard articulated, which is why, again, like why I just think this is a great movie, but just the way that he was like, when things start to get out of control, they basically have to bring in the mother, because if the mother says stop, then clearly like there's no reason to kind of continue. And it's like, again, it's one of those things like we're just getting at, where it's like, we do see the same playbook happening over and over and sort of over again, where someone does come out, the family does usually come out and they go, hey, the violence is not really the answer, and this, and sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't. But just like, I've never seen it articulated before that it was like, yeah, this is what they do in order to make sure that like more property damage, more riots, more violence, whatever doesn't happen. And I thought that was really powerful.
Right. And can we talk about, this is the second time in 2 weeks, we saw this in American Son as well. But can we talk about how they always bring in a black police officer to talk to the black family about this? Is that real? I mean, I was just like, in my head, I was just like, wait a minute, is this like a thing? Is this what they do in reality? Do they bring in a more a relatable character to deal with these families? That being a black character, which I thought kind of interesting. Again, like I just don't know what is gained by bringing in a black police officer to talk to these families. It happened in American Skin and it happened in American Son last week as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, even when you think about some of the press conferences that happened over the last year, they did have a black person there, but that might not necessarily be correlation. Like that might just be like, yeah, that just happens to be a position that happens to be like a city job. Like when you see most city workers, they do tend to be like minorities kind of thing. So it may be just one of those sort of coincidental sort of things, but I can imagine there's got to be strategy there. Like it's kind of like, oh, if you do have a senior sort of person, in this instance, it was the captain. So the captain could kind of be whatever. But it's one of those things where I feel like that it probably is a tactic to be like, hey, not all police are this archetype that you have in your head right now. Like some of us are, these people, which I think they do address, which we'll kind of get to when we get to the hostage sort of scene. But it's like some of us look like you, sound like you, grew up like you. And so I am here to sort of lend credence to Team Blue to tell you that like, hey, like we're looking into what happened, but like you can't burn down the city sort of thing. And I think like in a later scene when Link says, like this movie definitely got to me in ways that like I wasn't expecting, but like especially when Link kind of says, like kind of towards like the, in the second act and the beginning of the third, when he's like, why is it that the black community is the only community expected not to do anything? Where he's like, we kind of take it, on one cheek, we turn the other cheek, and then we just kind of like keep doing it. He's like, we're not allowed to respond, whereas other people can respond. And I was just like, man, like I was like, that I sat with for like the next day. Cause I was just like, yeah, like there really isn't, when you think about all these people, even the people who get like in trouble for silly stuff, like they'll get on Twitter and they'll say this and blah, 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 blah. Like it's like, there is this conscious or subconscious blowback that tends to happen. Just it feels like in a more severe way when black people sort of speak up, and even when you think about like people in jobs and all this kind of stuff, and like, with tickets and all this, it was just that really stuck with me. That line that he says, and that's kind of exemplified with that scene earlier too.
Yeah, the get over it.
Yeah.
That's another line that comes back with the police officers.
Yeah.
So yeah, good call out. And I think one part we even missed is the cousin, right? The emotional cousin.
Yeah.
When that black police officer comes in to his auntie's house, he is the cousin of Kajani, and he just has zero faith at this point. And you can't fault him for that. And it's a situation that's trying to be calm, and the police officer is asking for no violence. She needs to go out and make a statement of no violence, of no rioting. And this cousin is just not having any of that, is he? He's just so angry, so emotional. A lot of foul language aimed at these police officers, and he's not wrong, right? Is he? I think it's a point of view that you could take either side and say maybe he's not helping. He's throwing gasoline on the fire and he's not helping the situation where it is now. But the things he says, why are you here? Like, you don't care. This is my cousin. Here's a picture of my cousin, and then the mother gets into it. Do you have kids? To the police officer, are they still breathing? Things like that. And I think that's just a situation, like scene to scene. I know we're just at the beginning of the movie here, but like scene after scene is so powerful in this movie.
Yeah.
Whereas and it's different settings, right? Like it's the house, it's the precinct, it's somebody else, it's the cousin's house. It's like different settings with all powerful statements in every single setting. Which I really, really love about this movie.
Yeah, it felt all of the stages really, really well. Even as we were saying, after the initial, death of his son, even showing like this is kind of where he works, this is sort of what the relationship is like, and just sort of the matter of factness. And like I wasn't even expecting the trial, but then as you said, when you do get that like quick, just sort of throwaway, like it didn't go our way sort of thing. Like it's like it's like the characters going through the motions because like they've just been worn down by just years and years and years of like this is just how it goes sort of thing. But I did then appreciate, I felt like I think initially I was thinking, oh, maybe the beginning might be a little bit slow, but then it really brings home the desperation, and even kind of as you were saying, just like how sort of crazy it sort of gets when you do get to the point where it's like, okay, like these are veterans that are now storming this sort of, they've kidnapped the police captain and are now going to basically take this police precinct in order to kind of find the cop that actually did it. It actually unfolds in a very like believable way, because even when you add in the layer that's not addressed at all, I don't remember it being really addressed at all in the movie, of just like even how much like our country just sort of like forgets veterans and doesn't really do anything with them. Like it's like you would think that would be sort of one of the most prestigious honors to like come back from a veteran and just sort of have all these things sort of taken care of, but then just how much of a nightmare they then have to go through after having served their country. And so it's just it was all that just felt believable to me, that it's kind of like, okay, this is happening. You have the one veteran who, again, kind of mentioned Mario Hardwick, where he's just like, I'm going to die anyway. You have sort of the uncle that was there and some of the other kind of buddies, and it's just like, look, what else do we have to lose, kind of thing. Like he's already lost his son because he's got on borrowed time because of cancer. Like if we can do at least one thing that kind of gets closure or justice or whatever happens, let's go do it. And then, as I was saying, I think from the expectation standpoint, I was worried that initially, like not at this point, I was kind of expecting more of like a conversational, kind of a poignancy there. But like before, actually sat down to watch, it was like, oh, I hope this isn't sort of like a shootout kind of situation that then kind of turns into, a 90s, Michael Bay or whatever kind of thing. And definitely this just kept rolling from what I think, as you just said before, like every scene after scene. And as it starts to come together into this hostage situation, I think the movie played really well on your, like what you're expecting a movie to do. And then this movie kind of either shortened it or kind of like moved right through it and kept going in a very, very kind of interesting way, even to the point when he sits down in the interrogation room facing the cop that shot his son. I thought we were going to be there for a while, and it was just a couple of words, and then he got up and walked out, and I was like, oh, this is like every lazy choice that could have been made in this movie is not being made. I just really appreciate that. It's really great.
Yeah, that was also a great scene. I agree. That was, and I thought that was going to be it.
Yeah.
You watch the trailer and you get an idea that something's going to happen, like he's going to seek, take matters into his own hands, and you get that from the trailer. What you don't get from the trailer is how he does it, how he seeks justice. And I think that a lot of people watching the trailer could be like, oh God, this guy just went nuts, and he's taking justice to matters to his own hands. He's going to kill people or whatever it is. He's going to go off the, deep end, and start killing people, getting revenge and going after all these cops and making them pay. but that's not. I know this, now we're doing spoilers, so we're at the point where we're spoiling the movie. So, but that's not necessarily how he does it. In fact, he does it in a very debatable way. In my opinion, it was the greatest way he could have done it.
Yeah.
And again, like I get back to the fact where like I just didn't know it was going to be a simple. All right, let's get my boys together. Let's get my crew together. We're gonna go ahead and kidnap this police chief, and we're gonna go ahead and walk into this police station with guns and just take the whole place hostage. And I thought at first from like it went from like 0 to like 60, you know, and I was just like, okay, like this is pretty nuts. And then that face to face with the police officer who killed Johnny, his son, that was where I was like, okay, I think this is just going to be it. I think that he's going to talk to him. He's going to threaten him a little bit, make him scared. Maybe he'll kill him in the end. But that short interaction that you explained, Brandon, I thought that was it between them. I thought that was the end of it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It wasn't. And I'm happy. I'm happy that it wasn't.
Yeah, I think what, again, which is handled extremely well, is you go from this sort of storming of the police station to a jury, like essentially sort of a this sort of situation, which again, like if you were to just tell someone that happened in real life, it would sound absurd. But then as you're watching it kind of like happening in real time, it starts to make sense. Like even down to him, kind of calling sort of his wife, or rather his wife kind of called him, to him having the conversation with like, what are your demands? I want my son, and all these kind of things. It felt really organic. And I think like the movie walks the line between like, this could have been over stylized and just, like almost melodramatic, to just sort of, here is a guy who is in control of the situation based off of his, veteran status, having done his 2 tours, but also, emotional because of like everything that's happened. And it's like he just can't seem to get any kind of anything to go his way that at least feels sort of satisfactory. So as he starts to put together this jury, I thought was also really fascinating, is it was like, okay, here are people who are just sort of clerks and computer guys, kind of, as he says, but then he goes and he gets the prisoners, which is a whole other layer that I was not expecting to be in the movie. That again was just like an awesome touch. And so when he sets up and he's like, here are the jurors of 12, and the one cop, Hispanic cop, basically is just like, oh, there's not I think it was actually the cop who shot his son, was just like, oh, well, there's not a single cop on there. And he's kind of like, oh, well, like now you get it. Like he's like, now kind of how I feel. And again, like that felt like a really good line that again could have been over delivered and just again made it melodramatic, but it was just like the way that everything was kind of coming together just felt like, oh, this is cool. And not only like have we gotten to this point in the movie now again, like the expectation was that there was just going to be this, almost call it public forum conversation between Link and the cop. But then when it starts to kind of turn into, I think it was like the other cop, kind of the Hispanic cop, kind of says, he kind of ends up defending his brother in arms, and then the jurors kind of start to get into the mix. I thought it was just again like a great way of introducing what American Son was sort of unable to do, just because of the economy of, there only I think 4 actors, maybe 5 in that entire movie, of having all of these different points of view now kind of front and center, and watching all these things clash in real time, even to the point where, and again, like as we talked about last week with American Son, of just not really quite at least even getting to understand the psychology of the police side of things, having not only, Team Blue trying to basically be unified, watching each of them emerge as individuals, even kind of to the point where it was like, the one was like, hey, like I'm Team Blue all day long, but like you guys can't pretend like it's not hard for me to be a woman in this force or like in this world, kind of thing. Yeah. Which I thought was really cool, just watching all of that unfold.
Yeah, I mean, on one side of this is the trial that he has inside a police station. And just a note about the jury, it is ex-cons, but it's also normal citizens as well. And it's so the jury is so diverse. It's as diverse as it could be. It's you
It's
have
very true.
two white females, you have a white male. You have on the prisoners, you have several African Americans, you have Hispanics there as well. But to the cop's defense, there is not one cop on there, and that's the line, right? That's the point. Like the jury is not on your side. It's never a jury of your peers, as it should be. So that's such a great line where he's like, "Now you know how I feel." That's so great. And in this room, if you could just be a fly on the wall, I mean, you're actually watching the movie, but if you could just see what's happening on one side of the room, you have these police officers being held hostage, all the boys in blue and a woman in blue being held hostage. On the other side, a jury that is going to decide the fate of the shooter who killed Kajani, Link's son. It's if you could just envision it, like don't even like this to me is the greatest service of this movie.
Yeah.
Right here. Because it's not just, oh, you get to hear one side of the story here. Nate Parker's character sets it up so that you actually have to explain. The cop has to explain. All the cops have to explain why they do, what they're thinking, what they're being trained, like what's going through their head. And to me, this is just a great, great service from this movie. I think you could just watch this entire conversation. It's a long conversation, right? It's a long scene. But you could just watch this conversation between the cops and the jury. And an incredible conversation and good points made on both sides.
Yeah.
Even on the side of the cops. The cops saying, like, you guys do this to yourself. Like, it's look at the tattoos. And he was talking to the Hispanic man who spoke Spanish, who had paraphernalia, who gang paraphernalia and all these tattoos on him. But do you know what? Like, do you know what's so powerful about this scene as well? The man who has all the tattoos on him, he's speaking only in Spanish.
Yeah, I thought that was awesome.
He's
With no subtitles, which I thought was awesome.
With no subtitles. So you don't even know what he's saying.
Yeah.
No subtitles. You don't even know what he's saying. But what happens? The other officer understands him and just answers his questions, debates him in English as almost if he's afraid of his own identity of being Spanish. As almost he's afraid of being Hispanic and just wants to support his boys in blue and just wants to come across as a white American and not a Latino officer. The movie has so much of it. It's just like, for me, like that was something that I just caught and was like, this is insane. Like, he's not even responding to him. He understands everything he's saying, but he's not even responding to him in Spanish. He is responding to him in clear American dialect and in English so that his officers can hear him and his officers can know that he's on their side. Whether that be the case, it's probably a little bit of both, or maybe he just doesn't want to identify with his Latin community or whatever it is.
No, that's a great point. Yeah.
But then we keep going, right? I don't know if you want to interject, but then we keep going. And midway through the conversation, the cop who shot Kajani says, out of fear, after being pressed, I did what the training told me to do. Like I followed the training to a T, and I did exactly what it told me to do. And this is the outcome. This is what happened. And then the ultimate admission, right? Like maybe I'm jumping too far. I want to let you get a word in here, but I'm jumping too far. And I'm just really, really excited about like this whole scene because I really do think that if you're going to sit down and try to understand the problem on both sides, this scene is it. Yeah. This is like one of the greatest scenes ever to understanding the problem. But he says, the cop says, "You damn right I did." I'm not going to go into saying like what that meant right now because I want to hear your thoughts. Maybe we're not there yet. But the officer finishes by saying, "You damn right I did," which is another powerful statement in this entire movie. I want to get your thoughts first before I go into like "You damn right I did." Like, what was that?
No, I definitely agree with the Latin identity piece for sure too, because I think that was something where it was like the entire time. There's always this aura of how dare you question us kind of thing. Like it's like this is the law. Like you can't, like what we do is gospel. There is nothing that you can say or wiggle out of. Like you're a criminal. Like I look down on you. You're not on our level, sort of thing. And you're right. Like I think that exchange between the prisoner, the Hispanic prisoner, and sort of the Hispanic cop, I think was just really, really strong because even in the prisoner's sort of body language, it was just sort of like almost like exuding everything that you were just saying, where it was just like you and I aren't so different. You know what I mean? And it's just like you just happen to like grow up the way you grew up. I grew up the way I grew up. We're just kind of like almost like doing our
Exactly.
own thing. And it's just like, but you just won't admit it kind of thing. And that just kept getting the Hispanic cop like riled up. And I think it was a great point call out that you said where it's just like, you know, he doesn't respond in Spanish at any point. It's just kind of like he doesn't even want to be associated with that part of his own culture. Like he's sort of afraid of being like, oh, the second my boys in blue see me as, you know, not me as this officer, but they start to see me as that, like that's going to be sort of the end or I'll lose respect, which is the ultimate irony because of the way that he then can't make that same parallel with like the black community and how he's just kind of being like, hey, like you guys do this to yourselves, you guys, you know, why were you even there, like what is this all about, like look at what you're doing, you're not helping sort of thing. And it's like he almost is just sort of in this very very ironic way, it's just unable to sort of make that connection. Even when the female cop kind of says it, he's almost sort of in disbelief of being like, well, what do you mean, like how can you're, you know, we're just all cops kind of thing. Like he almost forgets to realize that it's like, well, you're cops kind of because like, you know, by choice if you will, but like your humanity, your skin color, your background, who your parents were, how you grew up, like that was all out of your control. That's just inextricable from what your personality is. The part that you're saying with like the cop, I do think totally agree with you that it's like if this is almost required viewing for anyone who's just sort of been mired in, you know, wherever your political leanings, wherever your moral leanings. I just think this is a great scene, as you said, because I think it does make everyone have to explain their motivation, both the cops and I think even some of the criminals kind of go into it and kind of ask some really pointed questions. But I think what was fascinating was even the details, how they keep sort of being glossed over. And we see this in real life where they kind of say, hey, like where I thought the body cams were supposed to basically be readily accessible. We're supposed to know definitively via the body cam that it was like, oh, yes, the human memory you may have thought he had a gun, but then the body cam is supposed to just immediately be like, no, he didn't have a gun. So like case closed, like this is a wrongful shooting, you're fired, you're whatever, blah, blah, blah. And it just seems like even the cop explains where he's like, yeah, we're just taught to go home. Like it's kind of like you're just supposed to like go home and like think about it, and someone comes in and as the prisoner says, he's like, you know, that's to get your story straight. And so like as you hear this cop sort of being whittled down, the cop who shoots just sort of whittled down and whittled down, of having to actually admit that it's like you are at fault here, but in some ways it's like the training is supposed to like make you callous to the mistake,
Right.
which is like crazy to think about. Like, the part that like I will think about for the rest of my life is when he says the line where he's like, we're taught not to de-escalate. And I was just like, when you go back to that opening scene and you just think, this is getting out of control, where is the quote unquote adult on authority to be like, everyone take a breath, this isn't that serious, we're just trying to do blah 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 blah, such and
Exactly.
such, like there's no need for whatever, like this and this and this, I need to do this so you can go home, so I can go home. Everybody wants to go home, that gets reiterated a lot. But then the cop just keeps saying like, it's like we're taught not to de-escalate. When it's once a gun is drawn, it's drawn. And it's almost like when you hear that, you're like, so if that's true, even if you like kind of draw your gun, just deadly force is just an option now for like no real reason. Like it's like that kid could have sneezed, that kid could have like been having an asthma attack, reaches into his pocket. There could have been like a variety of things that just happened to happen, but because the gun's out now, it can be used. And I was like, that's insane to me. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's research. I don't know, whatever. But like starting to get into that mentality now of just thinking again, like we were saying, speculating about last week about like, what are these cops taught that like when they enter into these situations that things can just go from 0 to 60 unnecessarily. It's wild to me that they're like, oh, you can't de-escalate. And so now it's me going home above all else. Whereas, you know, for instance, in the military, it's sort of like for the good of the mission, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. Nothing to add there. I totally agree. And I think that um, I the whole thing about the police training, and he's sitting there and he's wondering how he could have followed the police training to a T and wound up where he is now. And I think that's just so powerful. But a couple of lines there, I agree with you, but I just wanted to add a couple of things.
Yeah.
Like he says that, you know, the training, I perceived you as a threat, and I perceived him as a threat, and I was scared for my life. In both American Son and American Skin, it's very quick in American Skin. But Kajani's actually killed with his back turned towards the cop. So again, this I believe he's like maybe he's running away, maybe he's like taking a few steps to his father, but he gets shot in the back a couple times. So I just want to throw that out there. I'm just not sure why
Yeah.
the police officer could have perceived him as a threat at that point. But that's what's wrong with the training, because it says if you perceive, we're led to believe that the police officer is saying that the training allows this. If you fear for your life, if you're perceived as a threat, even with your back turned, if you're perceived as a threat, then you have the authority to save your own life, to act to save your life, which means killing the person that is causing the threat or harm. And for me, like, that's not good enough for police training, because being perceived as a threat is open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Right. So like you could be perceived as a threat by any officer, and then not perceived by a threat by another officer in a different situation. So that's another thing. Like, again, I don't know, and we should not. I think you and I shouldn't talk about too much about the steps of police training or what goes into police training. That's not what we're trying to do here. But it does seem like those statements that he's making, if true, if those statements that he's making, if true, are definitely cause for harm here, especially against African Americans.
It's also, I think, interesting to think about the context of the environment. Again, like, this is just total speculation here when you kind of start talking about, you know, training extrapolated by this movie, and kind of what the cop sort of talks about when, you know, they say, like, you know, there's a lot of really interesting details that sort of came out that, again, when you start looking into even real life cases where he just goes, oh, you were speeding past the intersection. It was just like, you can't speed in that intersection. It has speed humps. And like, that's kind of like a weird, like, everyone's like the cops almost are in disbelief that that was the case. And then he's like, oh, well, how fast was I going? Oh, well, you didn't clock it. You didn't. And then again, they kind of have to admit that it's like, no, you're not allowed to sort of do that. And then they just keep kind of drilling away at these stories that normally just get glossed over. And I'm sure, you know, it probably gets written into reports and everything kind of gets dismissed, of just like, oh, there are the speed humps. Oh, the car was actually insured, and like all these sort of like details that just eventually sort of come out. And I think like the piece of all this training then is, it's like, when you look at the context of threat, it just doesn't, from a common sense standpoint, and obviously like when you're in the situation, it's just you're going to react differently than sort of, you know, being outside of it, kind of the way that we are, you know, talking about it now. But it's like, it would seem to me, if you're in that kind of neighborhood, there, like, a shootout is not going to happen. Like, it's like, yes, you're still on alert, kind of the way that they were, but just the fact that he was kind of like, oh, this 14-year-old is going to step out of the car and shoot me. This guy who is, you know, very calmly explaining something. He's not antagonizing me with his words. He's kind of complying with everything that I'm saying. Like, this guy isn't going to shoot me in the middle of, you know, the quote unquote Hamptons, if you will. Just arbitrary name, arbitrary kind of neighborhood. But it's just like, it's one of those things where it's just like, that's the level of things that's very puzzling from a standpoint. Again, like, however much of this is true or exaggerated or dramatized for the purposes of this movie, it's like things like that again, why I think, you know, what you said is 100% true, of just like, this scene really underscores a lot of that conversation that is happening right now, where people kind of get unnecessarily polarized, where they go, oh, well, if you're asking the question, if you're simply asking the question about police training, then you're anti-cop. And it's like, no, we're like trying to figure out what is happening from like a human perspective here, because it's like the cop is almost secondary. What is happening to this human being who does this job, that just sees someone who is 14 years old and goes, I'm about to die, so I have to kill him. And it's like, right, you know, it's one thing if no one, I think, is trying to push back against, oh, that kid definitively had a gun and shot at me. No one, that's not even part of what this conversation is. It's like, why are you thinking, again, in this neighborhood, in this situation, the kid clearly has a phone, like all these sort of things that, like, oh, I now have to draw my gun. Oh crap, I can't de-escalate. So the only conclusion I can do is to like shoot him. It's just like a strange thing to, that's kind of the protocol, that's sort of the series of events. But again, like, the movie does that in a very, handles that in a very, just in a great way, because as you're watching, even the jurors kind of respond to what's going on. As you see like Link respond, as you see even some of the other officers respond. And I remember even kind of watching how the captain was responding when they kind of catch his face in some of the things, because like, I guess thankfully they didn't overdo it with him to kind of be like, as a black captain, I have to, like, I'm glad no one said the as a, you know, because I always get agitated when people do that sometimes, but it's just like, I just really appreciated how you could just see him almost like acting the conflict. You know what I mean? Like he was just in the back, and he's like, yeah, I know this is happening, but like I got mine. Like I'm the captain. Like who we have no idea how much crap he had to put up with in order to even get to that position. And so he now has to sort of work, you know, the as the stereotype kind of goes, he has to work 10 times as hard just to be above scrutiny that now that he has that position. But yeah, it was just like everything that kind of happens with that guy with the cop who shot Kajani, and just sort of watching everyone in that room react, I just thought was really, really well handled.
I agree. Nothing to add there. I think you've said it pretty eloquently. But I totally agree there.
The piece that I definitely nearly got choked up on is when there's a little bit of a skirmish. They have to go vote. They go, the jury starts to deliberate, and they're kind of talking about it. And then the guy who's like the documentarian of the movie, the kid, basically has this speech, which is basically, you know, again, like definitely watch the movie because it's a great scene. But like to paraphrase it, it's like he's trying to wrestle with both sides. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's like he understands at this point, especially, that this isn't just black people and the cops. Like this is Link, and this is that woman, and this is that guy. And like at this point in the movie, he understands everybody's perspective. And so he's trying to figure out like, oh, there has to be a logical way through this. Like there actually has to be a very simple, there's something we're missing. And it's like, he's quiet and everyone's kind of deliberating, and you kind of have some of the, you know, people asking questions and kind of like this, between that one prisoner, I think his name's Mo, I had it written down before. Mo McRae, kind of like the black, kind of like smooth talking kind of, I've seen him play drug dealers and a few other kind of movies. And then like sort of the, you know, stereotypical kind of white woman who's just kind of like, well, you know, she tries to sort of do the comply thing. And I thought like even their dialogue, and he's listening to all that. And then his speech when he's just kind of like, look, I don't even know what's going to happen here, but like, if everything that's going on in this moment even causes the police to just think about what's going on for 1 minute, then we have to do this. And like, that's such like a wild idea, again, piggybacking off of what I was saying earlier that Link says, where he's just kind of like, why are we the only people that are expected to just take it? And it's just like, I like that this kid who hasn't even presumably dealt with any of this, like he's still kind of at that age, he's still kind of, you know, he's untouched by the harshest realities of this. It's sort of it's at arm's length. It's through a screen that he sees on TV type of thing. And he now is sitting there confronted with the choice of like, sometimes you may actually have to choose violence in order to sort of get heard. And like prior to this moment, prior to being in this police station, that's something that he probably would have emphatically denied. And I just think that was really a really great kind of moment for him.
Yeah, he evolves. I forgot his name at first, but I think it's Jordan.
Yeah.
He evolves in the movie, and but he's always like his character. I think he's just a great actor.
Yeah.
You know, he comes in, he's like, hey, like, tell me about your son. You know, he's filming this documentary. He's very calm. His voice is calm. You get this idea that he's very level-headed, and from the get-go, he's unbiased. And mind you, in that skirmish that you mentioned, Jordan wasn't even supposed to be a juror.
Yeah.
You know, he had to step in, like Link says, I'm not asking you. You're jumping in because Link's uncle was shot in the skirmish. So he jumps in and he doesn't want to do it. You know, he's very reluctant to go in and try to come to this decision. But another powerful scene, he's in the jury room, and he's talking to everybody in the room, and he's convincing them, not even convincing them, he's just speaking out loud and saying his thoughts and how he's feeling, and he gets really, really choked up, right?
Yeah.
And then you get choked up because you're like watching it and you're just like, oh man, this is like super emotional.
Yeah.
And then he ultimately, as you mentioned, he ultimately comes to the conclusion that yes, like, I understand everybody's side of the story. And let me take a step back and say that there's diversity of thought in that room, right? There's reluctance. It just so happens that the whites in the room are the ones who are on the backing the blue, and the blacks are backing, Link and his crew. So it just so happens that it is that way. I would have liked it to have been a little bit less obvious in that way. Um, but I do think that in the end, like the powerful statement that he made, to your point, Brandon, um, was, if this is what it takes so that this family doesn't have to suffer again, no family has to suffer like this ever again, then so be it, you know?
Yeah.
Uh, and then they go on, and that seems to be the catalyst to concluding that this jury has now found the officer that shot Kajani guilty.
Yeah, it's almost, I'm sort of like laughing over here because I feel like I feel like the white people in the movie are the only people who like were like, yo, we're hostages. Like everyone else is having like a legit conversation, and then they're like, yo, what are we doing here? Like, are we about to, like, you know what I mean? It's just like they're the only people that are like, by the way, we've been taken hostage. Like, we're not supposed to be here, and now we're being
That's so
told that we
right.
have to like vote and like possibly kill this man. Which that was sort of funny. Um, yeah, it's I think, Jordan convinces them, and so they kind of do their verdict. And it's like I feel like the entire movie, especially like when what I thought was cool when I think I don't know if it's when he assembles. Yeah, it's when he's first putting the jury with like the prisoners together, and he kind of says that line where they're like, you vote your conscience, do whatever. And I think it's the Muslim guy that's like, yo, like, if we do this, are you prepared to go all the way? Like, it's not really like, we don't really care. Like, it's almost like, it's like everyone's aware that this is sort of just a hostage situation. We're playing this game, but they're like, yo, if this works out, like, are you prepared to like go the distance kind of thing? And I was sort of just back and forth about it. Like, I feel like the entire sort of situation, because you're kind of like, you want the vengeance because it's like, you're sort of in some ways living through him vicariously. But then on the other hand, you are much like Jordan dealing with this sort of like morality issue. Like, it's like to just kill another person in cold blood. You don't necessarily want this like eye for an eye justice, but you are watching this story just completely devolve and devolve and devolve into a point where you're like, okay, like, I don't know what the outcome is here. And that's a great writing. That's a really great storytelling, to just be conflicted and like not knowing what's going to happen. And so then when this cop basically is sort of knelt down and he's forced to sort of call his wife and kid, it was even sort of just, again, like a great touch, great acting on like that cop's part, to just sort of be like, yep, I'm saying goodbye to you. Like, this is kind of it. Like, this is what I deserve. This is kind of what's happening. I just thought that was like a really great scene. And then even to the point where he then finally like puts the gun sort of up to his head, I still had no idea what was going to happen. Like, I was kind of like, I feel like obviously there's sort of no real way out of this situation. And I think, from just like, in his world, like, it's kind of like the after kind of math of it. But again, was not expecting him to kind of be okay, like, we're going to go out in a blaze of glory sort of situation. So again, I have no idea what's happening, pulls the trigger, and then it's just empty. And it's just like that, like, I'm sure that hammer sounded super loud for like, the guy who thinks he's about to be executed, for all the cops and everyone just in there that just sort of loses their mind. I just thought that was just really, really well handled, because it is sort of this moment of like, you almost he gets to show him what it's like to think you're going to die. And now you have to sort of live in that moment afterwards with that consequences, and sort of your life now irrevocably changed. And even as sort of as things are sort of winding down, I was hoping they weren't going to ruin it by the cop kind of being like, oh, I understand kind of what everything. And like what he says, I think is fine, where he's just kind of like, I'm thinking about things now kind of thing. Whether or not that means anything, whether or not it goes anywhere, it's kind of, I think, for the, individual viewer to kind of like take that in, of like how much of this is a lesson, when we see things in real life of cop fined, cop fired, cop gets divorced, cop goes, like, how much of that actually impacts not just them, but like the people that they served with, other police, unions and precincts and things of that nature? Or is it just kind of like, oh, they got him, okay, well, we have to, whatever sort of thing. But I just thought that was all handled like really, really, really well. And again, like, to keep underscoring what you were saying, I just think that whole, everything in the police station is just something that I think needs to be seen by a wide variety of people.
I agree. And even with that police officer, everything that happens after he is found guilty, quote unquote, by the jury inside the prison, he makes him feel scared. Like, he makes him fear for his life. He gets him on his knees, right? And then he says, this is brilliant. He goes, call your wife and kid, call your family.
Yeah.
And put them on FaceTime. He didn't say put them on FaceTime. He says put them on video.
Yeah.
But it's FaceTime. So he calls them and they're on FaceTime and for me, I was shaking at this point. I think like I definitely did not want him to kill, because then everything, the whole mission is overshadowed by the fact that he killed this cop inside a police station and took the rest of them hostage. He still did that. Like, he still like took them hostage, but I think killing them would have been way too far. And I'm happy that he didn't kill the police officer in the end. That, like you said, it was just like an empty gun, no bullets, and the click. You hear the click, and it's just like, whoo, like everybody's like, I'm sighing. And I'm watching this and I'm like, oh, good, I'm sighing, because there's so much. It's so much more powerful to keep him alive.
Yeah.
It's so much more learning, so much more healing that can be done with him alive.
Yeah.
And I just thought, again, another just an end to a brilliant situation, brilliant conversation. If anything, I think like it's okay to watch the beginning. It's okay to watch the immediate end. The meat of this movie is really the interaction between the police officers and the jury and Link and crew. It's just so brilliant.
Yeah, I think the ending reminded me a lot of Get Out, in the sense of, have you seen Get Out?
I have seen Get Out, yes.
Okay, yeah. So spoilers for the ending of Get Out. I guess it's like a 5-year spoiler, 6-year spoiler. But I guess maybe a minor spoiler. It's probably not less. But anyway, when that movie basically kind of is at the climax, and you have Daniel Kaluuya, and he basically is, more or less beating, choking out. I think it's Alison Brie, who that woman is. He's basically like choking her out. And then you're sitting there in the theater and you're just like, finally, like this guy's sort of getting justice. And then you see sort of a cop sort of car pull up. I remember just feeling palpably in that theater, everyone was like, oh, this guy's done. Like, there's really no, like, it's like, yes, we were kind of on this like fantastical horror movie storyline, this thread, but then seeing these cop lights, we all know, because we live in our reality, that like there's really no way to explain this, and he's just going to die. And then that's kind of the end of that spoiler. So it's kind of like that cool projection that we have. And I thought what was really fascinating about this is that I was kind of like, I don't expect him to just walk out, but at the same time, I was kind of like, it would have been fine, because it would have, faded to black, and then you sort of get, you're still left with, the heavy movie. The fact that they kill Link, and then to the point to go full circle, where you then have the media being like, oh, crazed vet does blah, 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 blah. That was when I started to kind of like, was like thinking about the stuff that we talked about last week, about like, how much does the media just perpetuate things? Like, it's like, because now
you nailed that one for sure,
because now the media is like feeding the side of the argument of the people who are just like, oh, well, like, the far end of the spectrum, like potentially the white supremacist kind of side of it, that are just like, oh, of course, like that happened, like this is why we need to get behind the Second Amendment, this is why, blah blah blah, blah, such and such. And like, there's no, and that's just how it is. Like, that's kind of like what would happen. And then they kind of do the like, exactly kind of the like, oh, anyway, in other news, like here's like sports. And then the guy kind of does the like, oh, here's like a, almost not dehumanizing, but sort of idolizing then this black athlete, where it's just kind of like, oh, look at this guy, and he's 6'8" and he's going to do the such and such. And it's just like such an interesting juxtaposition, because again, you're like, the way that the media exalts athletes into a certain degree, like musical artists and some of these things, and how that layer of like money and fame can sort of insulate you from certain types of scrutiny. And then in this situation, they just look at this as like, oh, crazed veteran basically takes police hostage and does all this stuff. And granted, if this was for real and there was like a public sort of sense, yes, we get the, the documentary that Jordan eventually puts out that is probably a version of this movie, which is kind of a cool meta sort of situation. But then it is sort of like, we killed this guy, he had surrendered, And then you're kind of left to speculate. Does the captain say anything? Does that cop say anything? Do the other cops say anything? Like, I wonder how that would, we've never seen a situation like that where not only does one cop go, yeah, I messed up. And it's like, yeah, that's that's coming to me. Like, that's on me. And then even to go further of all those people being like, yes, we got taken hostage. Yes, this happened. Blah, 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 blah. The one person who got shot was kind of due to a prisoner, such and such, but like, didn't deserve to die, like blah, 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 blah. Maybe this is the only way that like they can sort of get their sort of message out. Like, it's just a really kind of like interesting how the media just created this sensationalized story and then just moved on.
Yeah, I agree. It is so crazy. And again, I interject there and say that, you were spot on. You made this point last week, and even more so, it was stronger in American Skin, where in the end, which I wasn't expecting. I guess I was hoping in some world that he would get out alive and maybe just go to prison,
Yeah.
But he doesn't get out. Spoiler: he doesn't get out alive. But the cop who's wronged him, the cop who killed Kajani Link's son, says, "I want to walk out with you." And I thought that was so powerful, and I really thought then and there it was like, let me walk out with you so that I can protect you. And he even says it, right? He even says he's unarmed. He's coming out.
Yeah.
All the hostages are out. He's coming out and he's unarmed. He's unarmed. He's unarmed. He says it like 3 times or whatever it is. And then boom, sniper, shot through the head. And he's down and he's gone. And right like that, just snap. They even walk over his body. They walk in like as if there's anything else in there, as if there's more of the crew in there. They're going to try to find more, of his accomplices. But they shoot him, SWAT, whoever it is, shoots him in the head. And his body lays on the floor, blood coming out of it on the floor. And you see the SWAT just step over his body and just go on about their mission.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's all about the training. It's all just about, okay, the suspect's been neutralized. We're going in to find more. It's just like boom, 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 boom. It's just so robotic, lacking in compassion. But this is what it is. The law enforcement is sticking to their training, and then the media like clockwork. And this is such a good call out you had last week. And then it's like, this guy had no problems. His problem was that his son was taken from him.
Yeah.
Unjustly, that was his problem. And then the media says, oh my God, it looks like this guy was, a member of ISIS, or he had mental illness, or whatever it was. And like you said, I actually thought it was quite funny. After that, they were like, well, here, check out this athletic sensation. Completely irrelevant, something totally different. It just rolls off. And that's what they leave you with, right? Like, to your point, it's just like, oh, man, so crazy. Like, this guy had a mental illness. Oh, what a shame. Over to you with sports, Mike. And then it's like, well, we took out this local athletic sensation. And it's so crazy because this is exactly what it is in real life.
Yeah.
Like, where do these stories come from, and why does it make national television? And then to your point, isn't there, like, there was so many officers in that room. There were so many people in that room that can say, wait a minute. I don't think none of that's true. This was actually a nice guy who was just wronged by one of our police officers. They're never going to say that.
Yeah.
Police officers aren't going to say that. But deep down, you want to believe that this officer learned a lesson here. But before we this is the end of the movie. We're at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
But before we close this out and go our own ways, I just want to say something. We missed. I want to just call out that we missed a crucial point here. And it was the racial profiling.
Yeah.
Of the police officer, which they admitted. A very, very obviously strong admission from that police officer that said that they didn't even know his speed limit. They didn't know how fast he was driving. The reason why they pulled him over in the first place. They estimated that he was going too fast. They didn't clock it, and the speed limit wasn't actually in the police report or how fast he was going because they never clocked it. But it gets back to what you were saying, that he was just a suspicious car in a neighborhood that shouldn't have been. And that whole argument by the police is like, you guys want us to keep you safe. We keep you safe by pulling shady characters over, and then I believe the Muslim prisoner then says, oh, so you were racial profiling, which is why you pulled them over in the first place. And he goes, yeah, damn right I did.
Yeah.
And that was like, like, boom, like, oh my God. Like you only pulled them over because there were two black people driving a car in a neighborhood that you don't deem for relevant to them. So that's what I want to I want to make sure, like, everybody, we did a lot of spoilers tonight, but if you're listening and thinking about watching this movie, just know that racial profiling was the reason. Like, it was the only reason. There was nothing else suspicious other than racial profiling being the reason why this cop pulled over this father and this son in the first place. So I just want to make sure, like, that's very clear here.
Yeah, it's that moment is actually it's a really powerful moment because, again, like, they had just kind of both been going back and forth about, everybody just wants to go home kind of thing. And, like, when you boil it down to how simple everybody could have gone home and Kajani being alive, and it was just, oh, here are two black people in a neighborhood that, like, I don't believe black people should be in. It's kind of, again, like, it's crazy how simple that is. And, like, again, like, when you kind of go into, like, not only just, like, the training, but then, and no one even kind of says it, I think, in the movie, but, like, when you start to get into, like, abuse of power, and then kind of what we were saying earlier about the Hispanic cop just kind of being, like, presenting this, you're not really even allowed to, like, question us kind of thing. Like, we just do what we do because, like, it's for the greater good sort of thing, the sort of blind belief that is allowed to forego mistakes and common sense. But yeah, it is, because I think even one of the prisoners kind of, like you're saying, the Muslim guy, and even the other guy, I think it's just like, well, he would be alive if he wouldn't have done that sort of thing.
Exactly.
That's definitely just a really powerful moment too, because it is one of those things where you like, I think they've talked about it here in New York, some of the older days of, like, stop and frisk and some of these things, and it's like, it is one of those things sometimes where you just kind of go, what if you just didn't stop him, kind of thing. Like, it's like, is there really anything to be gained? It's kind of like the like, when you've been driving, you probably get this a lot, kind of you used to drive through Jersey and such, where it's like, sometimes you just see them with these speed traps and they're just pulling people over because they have to hit a certain quota, and then they have to, like, make a certain amount of money kind of thing. It's like, they don't even really need to, they're just doing it because of, like, reasons that, like, don't matter kind of thing. And it's one of these things where it's like, I just wonder how many situations didn't need to happen to begin with, forgetting the escalation, forgetting all that stuff, forgetting the, like, oh, okay, they're suspicious, something's in your car, that person's acting this, the antagonistic, blah, 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 who they just go, oh, we're going to stop those guys just because they are suspicious to me for reasons that, like, they weren't swerving, they literally weren't doing any of the things that they were trying to put on them as having done. It's interesting.
Yeah, just another powerful moment. Great movie. What a movie. I love it so much. I already texted my mother and texted my brother and told them to watch it now. So I'm also eagerly awaiting their thoughts.
Yeah. Any final thoughts? Anything that else that we may have missed? Or do you think we pretty much got it?
No, I think we got it. Watch the movie. The middle part especially is very important. So many good points here. For me, it's a level better than American Son. American Skin is a level better than American Son. And I think it's a movie that I absolutely love, and will probably watch over and over again just to make sure I didn't miss anything.
Yeah. I could probably guess the answer to this already. Trying to categorize these a little bit. Would you classify this as required viewing, recommended viewing, or there are better movies?
It's funny because if you had asked me that, I don't think you asked me that about American Son.
No.
And if you had asked me that about American Son, I would have said required viewing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna change that now and say American Son is recommended viewing.
Yeah.
But this one, American Skin, is absolutely required viewing. Just for the sheer fact that you get to hear the point of view from police officers, and you want to feel that these police officers have a very hard job and they make valid points. I mean, like, you could sit there and debate every single one of their points, but police officers do have very hard jobs, And you get to hear a little bit more about that in this one. You get to see two very angry forces, opposite sides of the spectrum, arguing their points and arguing their beliefs and trying to make the other side see what's right and what's wrong. And for me, that's an absolute requirement. If you don't even watch any other scene in the movie, just watch the whole hour or whatever that is, of that conversation. It's just so very well done. And there's a lot to be learned from both sides about what goes into a police interaction.
Yeah, completely agreed. Required viewing. I think, as you've already said, I just think the jury deliberation, the actual trial, both of those things, I think, just address a lot of lingering questions and a lot of biases and prejudices and all those types of things that I think a lot of people have. And I think the movie just handles it very, very well, especially because this is a movie that could have very, very easily made the cops seem like villains, and it made them seem like humans that are making mistakes, which I think is a really interesting distinction that we don't quite often see in movies like this, and which is why like movies like this are, as we're saying, required viewing, because you do get a lot of points of view, and I think people will relate to the people that they most identify with, but none of them are vilified. It's really just kind of understanding. It's almost a masterclass in showing how people with differing points of view should interact, because even though some of these people do end up shouting at each other, there's not a outright dismissal of someone else's point of view. It's just follow-up questions to be like, how strongly do you believe what you believe? Can we challenge that? Can you actually, with a straight face, tell me that that's true, kind of thing? And I think this is just a really, really, really well done, well executed.
Yeah, agreed.
And with that, my fellow feathers and arms, that is episode 2. As we mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack and becoming a Patreon of one of our tiers that start as low as $1. Our Patreon is also where you can submit movies with similarly controversial issues for guests to get into in the future. But of course, not all of those need to be as heavy as this one is, which will be exemplified by next week's pick, which I still need to figure out. But don't worry, we're not going to go down this road again. I think I was actually looking at, I think it's like a Monster on Netflix, but it was mostly because I wasn't expecting this movie to be that good. I feel like this movie's put a strong exclamation point on this particular issue for a little while. So we're good.
Agreed. And I'm still going to watch Monster, but agreed.
Yeah. Other than that, feel free to share, rate, and review us on the podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for our aforementioned sister shows. Thank you, Yfran, for joining me this lovely evening. Thank you, listeners, for taking the time to listen. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. He's Yfran Garcia. I'm Brandan Jones, and these are the conversations that quack. Good night.